Sup, y'all? Welcome to the Idea Space. My name is Yancey Strickler. In one of the most infamous quotes of the internet era, Facebook's first head of data told Businessweek, "The best minds of my generation are thinking about how to make people click ads. That sucks." That person was Jeff Hammerbacher, an important figure in data science who now works full-time in biomedicine. As the founding manager of Facebook's data team and co-founder of the publicly traded enterprise data company Cloudera, Jeff pioneered a lot of data techniques and ideas, including the title data scientist, that are foundational today. Over the past decade, Jeff's attention has shifted to medicine, working on cancer research at Mount Sinai, using computational methods to design personalized therapeutic cancer vaccines. He's also a founder and advisory board member of the COVID Tracking Project. And his current focus is a venture pharmaceutical studio called Related Sciences, which does early-stage research to identify and develop new pharmaceutical drugs. Jeff is someone who continues to have a significant impact on the world while being very quiet about it. He doesn't post on social media, and this conversation for the Idea Space is his first public interview in many years. Jeff is a dear friend and one of the smartest people I know. And in the conversation ahead, we talk about biomedicine, philosophy, science, Facebook, data science, and whether corporations should live forever. Here's Jeff. What's up? What's up? We're friends, but you know, I only kind of knew like high points of your bio in a way before these past week or two, like kind of digging more into your story. And there's, I don't know, a lot of things I learned in doing that. But so, the high points I knew were like, you grew up in the Midwest. You were very early Facebook employee. When we met, you were working at Mount Sinai doing cancer research. And there's other things in between. But yeah, what's your story?
Well, hey, Yancey.
Hey.
Thanks for having me. The story compressed. You got a lot of the high notes. Born in Michigan, grew up in Indiana. Dad worked at GM, mom was a nurse. Went to Harvard to play baseball. Declared English. Ended up studying mathematics. Worked as a quant on Wall Street right out of college in New York City. Quickly moved to Facebook, where I was one of the first people to try and work on data there. Ultimately built and led a group called the Data Team, which built our data infrastructure, as well as the data science group, which is certainly a moment of notoriety for me, in that we were really the first large publicly visible team to choose the title data scientist, and this title has become quite popular. So that was an adventure at Facebook, and we wrote some open source software that had commercial potential beyond just Facebook. And I joined Excel Partners, an early Facebook investor, as an entrepreneur in residence, and quickly helped create a company called Cloudera. Cloudera, I served as the vice president of products initially, and then ultimately the chief scientist, and helped grow the business, and eventually became a publicly traded company and still is today. Around 2012, 2013, Cloudera, we had hired a professional CEO, and the business was growing nicely. It was doing really what it was supposed to do. And I started getting more interested in applications of data science again, rather than infrastructure for data science. And that is what took me to Mount Sinai when we met. So yeah, I was on the board of a nonprofit called Sage Bionetworks with a gentleman named Eric Schott. And Eric had been recruited to be the chair of the Department of Genetics at Mount Sinai. And in discussing with him my interest in applying data science, he mentioned that it would be possible to create space for me within his department. to try and apply data science to biomedicine. So, started spending more and more of my time in New York City and built out a group there at Mount Sinai with no real mandate beyond just let's try and do some of the stuff that we did at Facebook and Cloudera here on the data they have at Mount Sinai. Ultimately became focused on cancer immunotherapy, which has really revolutionized cancer treatment. And that was a fun process to work on. Data.
So those were successful. Like that was a successful project. Like what was the outcome of that?
So it was an academic lab. So it was limited in its impact on any one project, but we work on a variety of different things, kind of on the periphery. So I'd say the thing that was really the primary focus of the lab was working on what's called a neoantigen vaccine for cancer. And a neoantigen vaccine is a therapeutic vaccine, not a prophylactic or a preventative vaccine, which can be counterintuitive to people, including me, who didn't realize that the term vaccine could be used in the therapeutic setting. So for people that already have cancer, we can take a biopsy of cancer tissue and a blood sample and do sequencing on both. And then we can look for mutations that occur in the tumor that don't occur in the blood, in the normal healthy tissue, that might be generating an immune response. So in the same way, many of us are getting vaccines right now, which are trying to tell our immune system to create antibodies and T cells that are specific for a small little sequence that's present in the virus, SARS-CoV-2 virus. What we were trying to do was make therapeutic vaccines, which would teach the patient's immune system to create antibodies and T cells specific for the tumor, but would leave the normal tissue alone. And so these mutations or the altered protein products generated by those mutations were known as neo, as in new antigens, and antigens are the things that the immune response is directed against. So there were a couple groups working on this. Amusingly, the primary commercial company working on a therapeutic neoantigen vaccine was BioNTech, which is now helped prevent me from getting COVID based on my Pfizer vaccination. So Ugur Sahin and BioNTech I was intimately familiar with their science through my work in neoantigen vaccines. And there were a few other groups that were working on neoantigen vaccines. There was a group at Dana-Farber led by Kathy Wu and Patrick Ott, and a group at Washington University in St. Louis led by a guy named Bob Schreiber. But Nina Bardwaj at Mount Sinai was definitely in the mix as one of the earliest people to be working on this. And we were lucky enough as a lab to encounter Nina during a formative stage of her neoantigen vaccine clinical trial. And we plugged in and were able to provide the algorithms that would pick up the sequencing data and ultimately tell Nina which antigens to target for the therapeutic vaccine. And so we were the group that in the phase 1 clinical trial was receiving data on the patients and then directing the peptides to be produced for the actual vaccine. So that was I think of that as a successful outcome for the academic lab, and it was a really exciting project to be involved in. And ultimately, we did a sponsored research agreement with a company called Neon Therapeutics, which had its own commercial neoantigen vaccine and was eventually acquired by BioNTech. So I guess you could say there was some commercial impact of our work as well. But yeah, that was really the main output of that New York lab. And then eventually I opened up a branch of our lab in Charleston, South Carolina at the Medical University of South Carolina. My wife and I chose to move down here to start a family, and ultimately shut down the New York branch of the lab and did more wet lab research. And then in 2019, I put my lab at MUSC on hold and started a biotech venture creation firm called Related Sciences, which is my primary professional focus today. And I guess that brings us up to the present. Mixed in there are things like, I taught a course at Berkeley called Introduction to Data Science for a couple of years that ultimately became the foundation for a degree granting program in data science, which was quite cool and interesting to be involved in. My wife and I do angel investing through a firm we call Tech Hammer. We've made over 120 angel investments. So that's something that I do with a portion of my time. And I've sat on the board of several companies. Currently on the board of a company called Ciox, which does electronic medical record data exchange, and only recently stepped off the board of a company called Cytel because it was acquired, which was a leading standalone biostatistics CRO. So it's pretty difficult to to create a
Yeah.
summary of all that's going on, but hopefully that gives you some background for my story.
Yeah. Thank you. So when you started at Facebook, it was the Facebook still. Is that right? Was it still the Facebook when you began?
That sounds right. It's, this is all lost in the sands of time. But yeah, I interviewed at the end of 2005 and started in the beginning of 2006. And somewhere in that time frame, we expanded from colleges to high schools. And then I think after I started, we expanded to corporations. And then later that year, the big thing was what we called open registration, which was allowing anyone with an email address to sign up. And I think somewhere in there, the branding might have evolved from Facebook to or from the Facebook to Facebook. That's right.
So what was your first project? What do you remember about first beginning? What was the state of data? Like what were you there to do?
Yeah. So the state of data was interesting. There was an internal tool called the watch page, which was every minute syncing the MySQL databases that deliver data to the website. It was running queries over that data and syncing results from those queries back to a single MySQL server, which would give you a sense of how many active users were on the website and how they broke down across networks. So the first order of business when I arrived was to create a more professional version of that would be referred to as a data warehouse that could collect data, um, a broader range of data. And then the questions that people wanted to ask of that data warehouse were primarily around growth. So, which of the networks were growing, which of them weren't, what was causing them to grow. So that was really the early focus. And then there was some thought that I should be involved in things like the ranking algorithm for newsfeed or the sponsored advertising ranking algorithms. Ultimately, that wasn't too much of a focus. We ended up being more of like a business intelligence function.
So when you're trying to find out or which areas are growing or why they're growing, now I feel like we have some implicit like you know data tech ways of thinking about that. But like, was that an easy question to answer then? Like, was it obvious to you what to do? Were you kind of creating the path to identify like triggers of growth or just like these clusters, or how nascent was that as you were looking at that?
It was very nascent. I don't think we really had any idea. We explored a lot of different hypotheses. So, at the time it was broken into networks. So we didn't really think of it as like a single product. It was more like, oh, at this college we took off, at this college we didn't take off. What could have caused that? And so we did analyses where I remember looking at like crawling student newspapers for mentions of Facebook and correlating that with user growth. We looked at things like the largest clusters of users, so the largest connected component or nearly connected component of users, thinking that there might be something in. We would often use we compare it to walking into a party where there are 7 people standing in the room all by themselves, or walking into a party where there's 7 people standing in a circle talking to each other. It's a different social experience. So we evaluated things like that. But we didn't really get rigorous for another year or two. And it was really, Matt Kohler was an early executive. And I remember him pulling me and Naomi Gleit, who I believe is actually still there as a pretty senior person. He pulled me and Naomi aside and basically said, we need to make growth like the number one focus for our analyses. And then my first hire was a guy by the name of Itamar Rosen. And Itamar, I basically said, hey, I want you to every week publish a thing called the growth report, which was literally a PDF where he would present a set of standardized metrics and then go deep on like one hypothesis. about what might be causing growth. And I think the growth report was a pretty fundamental tool internally at Facebook at the time that ultimately served as the foundation for the growth team. And ultimately, I think a lot of the term like growth hacking could be traced to like Matt kind of telling us to really emphasize growth for our analyses.
So I know I'm going to get the numbers wrong, and I've heard Chamath talk about it, but like a famous thing where you're trying to get like 7 friends in the first 3 days, or a certain number of friends within a certain timeline, and then you see certain user behaviors happen. Are those the kinds of things that were showing up in this growth report? So like all teams are being informed of, here's the emerging trends, here's like a language to talk about them, here's some analysis. It was something like that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it evolved quite a bit, particularly after I left. But yeah, I suspect that's referring to, I recall doing analyses. So what we would do is we would say, okay, let's take everyone who signed up in this 14-day period. Let's take everything we know about them and their activities on the site. And then let's follow them for 6 months or 12 months. So this would be like a cohort analysis. And let's try and predict their behavior 6 months, 12 months from now, based on what we saw them do in those first 2 weeks. And we would use a methodology known as feature selection, which would allow us to take all the variables that we put into that model and highlight the subset of those variables that was most predictive of the eventual outcomes. And then we would try and create narratives around those features which had high importance. And those features could be derived from hypotheses that different executives had. So if someone had a hypothesis that walking into a party with 7 people talking to each other had value, then we would figure out a way to formulate that quantitatively and include that as something that the model could put emphasis upon. And then we also did a bit of automated feature engineering to see if we could actually discover features computed from the basic underlying features. And so there's a lot of analysis, and we published some of this stuff publicly, but then ultimately, that became very controversial after I left. So I don't think the team published as much of what they found, but things like ensuring you had a profile photo. That's one that I can recall. So then we would try and push a lot of energy into the user experience to get them to put up a profile photo. And I remember another one we ended up finding that like events were big, like real world in-person events were big drivers of new connections and new signups on Facebook. So we would orient our marketing and like our field marketing around events because of that. So findings from the analyses would then trickle down into business strategies.
So I don't know how you want to credit it, but like you maybe created the title of data scientist there, in the coursework for your class on data science, you have some of the email exchanges where you're proposing the idea, data application scientist, I think was the first one you used. Still, I'm sure probably still the one you root for in your heart as the real title. But you talk about how like this was a different role for data, right? It wasn't an analyst. It wasn't a researcher. Like data scientists, you were sort of saying our jobs are something new and we need a new kind of title. Why? Why did you think that was the case? And how was this different than like, obviously Bear Stearns is a different kind of place, but like data-driven work before, what was different about this kind of work?
Yeah. Well, I can tell you the proximal cause, which was actually pretty simple. It's that we had certain people in our group who had PhDs, and there was a well understood research scientist title hierarchy. And we hired them away from research groups where they participated in that title hierarchy. And so when they joined our team, they wanted a title of research scientist. And there were other people who came more from the business intelligence realm, as it was known. And there's a title hierarchy there. And business analyst was the standard title. And I looked at my group, and at the time we maybe had like 12, 15 people. And I thought, this is really silly. Like, why do we need so many different titles for people who are really more athletes, who are capable of on one day writing a script to collect data from the source systems into our warehouse environment, who on another day are building a dashboard, and on another day are running a statistical analysis to identify what might cause people to use the site in a few weeks. And we really wanted people who were more adaptable and had a broad base of skills to keep the team small. And so it was really just one of these things where at my quarterly team retreat, I was getting pressure externally to kind of simplify, and in particular to squeeze out any notion of research. So at the time, there was negative connotations to being for people to be seen as being involved in research. Because it was all hands on deck. At this day, Facebook feels inevitable, but at the time, it certainly didn't feel that way. So it was really something that we wanted to emphasize, that everyone in our group was actually like contributing to the success of the product, not just like writing papers and doing research. So the proximal cause was effectively that I needed to get rid of the title research scientist in my team, and parsimony really led us to data scientist as the title that could preserve, I think, what they valued in terms of the science, but put the emphasis on, and we called our team the data team, because we had two sides. We had data scientists and what today would be referred to as data engineering. We called it data infrastructure. So it was really kind of a was recognizing our team was small enough that we didn't want premature specialization, and then saying, okay, if we're going to flatten titles and just go down to two titles, how can we capture what people value about research scientists and what people value about other title schemes? I mean, subsequently, people have done all this sleuthing and discovered that, people use the term data science in different contexts prior to our use of the term data scientist as a title. So I certainly don't want to assert that I've had any kind of unique claim to creating a field of thought. It really was just trying to find a title that captured what people liked about research scientists. But ultimately, there was something. I do think there is something. People felt unhappy with the available titles at the time because what the world was changing. I had a moment where, at the time, Google was such a dominant force in what could be done with data. And when I thought about, well, okay, why is Google considered so exceptional with data? It's not because they're publishing great like statistical algorithms. People didn't look at Google and say those are the best statisticians in the world. It was more that they had a muscle, a capability to think creatively about how consumer web products could be informed by data, and then to execute on building the infrastructure necessary to leverage data at the scale that they were able to leverage it. And so I thought more about, I want to build a group that gives Facebook that broad base of capabilities. I don't want to just build a group that gives Facebook. I had done many courses, and I was a mathematics major as an undergrad, and I did a lot of courses in the statistics department. So I felt like I had a good understanding of the shape of statistics, and I wanted to be more ambitious than that. So I wanted something that was a bit broader. And so, yeah, I think we were at a point in time where the amount of software required to do the job of a statistician or of a data analyst or of a business analyst was just ever increasing. And it was just becoming clear that you weren't going to be able to accomplish your day-to-day tasks if you didn't know how to write software. So I mean, like a statistician who can write software might be another great way to describe what a data scientist is in a summary. In my head, honestly, I thought of what we were doing as like applied epistemology. What we were trying to do was to know about the world. And we wanted to actually like know about the world. We didn't want to describe what it meant to know about the world. We wanted to actually like generate knowledge about the world. So yeah, there was a lot of things in the ether at the time that made the existing titles not fit. And I think the fact, never underestimate how fashionable, like Larry Ellison from Oracle always talks about how like software is even more trend driven than fashion. So the fact that we called people that at Facebook, and Facebook became this like meteoric success as a startup, is really the thing that explains it. I think, we could have called it really anything. And I think because Facebook did it, people would have adopted it.
So you left about a decade ago, right? Was it 10 years ago or a little bit before?
Even more, 2008.
2008. Oh, wow. Even longer. So, now like Facebook and data together are like these combustible words, right? It's just like explosion of fear, controversy, all these things. How do you reflect on that mood that exists around social data and Facebook specifically these days?
Uh, yeah, it's a completely different environment. I will say that like one of the books that I recall purchasing and reading to get ready for the job at Facebook was a book called Database Nation by a guy named Simpson Garfinkel. And, everything that he said in that book came to pass. It was really the subtitle of the book is The Death of Privacy in the 21st Century. So I guess in one sense, it all feels a bit inevitable. Like I actually had a moment when we were still living in San Francisco, and I remember turning to Hallie, and this is like, before the protests at the Google buses and things, and I knew, reading books like Bonfire of the Vanities and understanding the perception of the great wealth creators of the 80s in finance. And I just remember saying like, the people who are making money in technology, like these are going to be the most hated people in the world soon. like what is being done is not right. And we're going to have to, there's going to be a massive readjustment of us as a society. So everything that's happened has felt a bit teleological, but I don't, in terms of like, the other thing that's hard about it is there are, I still know people there who are what I consider to be good ethical people. And when you've like fully adopted the worldview of the corporation, you're unable to perceive these things. So it's interesting. I continue to hear, so compare it to how I think about like charter schools. And a good friend of mine from college is the president of a very large city's teacher union. I don't want to reveal her, the actual city, but so I hear obviously in the tech world, there's a lot of emphasis on charter schools as a good solution to education. But then I hear about it from her and the side of the teachers union, and it feels like actually this conversation is much more fraught with difficulties than I'm hearing from your side. And so it's interesting to continue to hear the bull case from the people inside of Facebook. But ultimately, I think the bears are mostly right that we've achieved a level of like utter imbalance in surveillance and data use, and we need to rigorously regulate surveillance if we're going to get back to a healthy society.
So you don't look at the critiques and think these are emotional arguments. You think these critiques are founded on real issues, and that were many of which were foreseeable. Was it just that like, you're the only one reading a book like that? If you would try to share ideas like that in a meeting in 2007, 2006, what happens? Does everyone just laugh, or what happens?
That's a great question. I often describe the process of building a hypergrowth startup as removing all of the arrows which point in a different direction from the direction that the founder CEO is trying to take it. So at the time, Facebook felt like a very open intellectual environment where you could say that kind of thing in a meeting and there was no real repercussion. Like people were genuinely trying to figure out what this new world was that we were creating and how we fit into it and the right way to evolve along with it. I think once you reach a certain scale, that sort of deliberation is not helpful if your goal is to get to the scale that a Google or an Amazon or a Facebook has achieved. So there was definitely a thinning of heterodox viewpoints that occurred in the era in which I was leaving. I can actually remember I told my boss that I was planning to leave, and he was like, okay, like let's try and arrange things that we can soften that landing. And so he's like, let's not tell people, let's do it for a couple of months. And then like, we'll tell people, and then you'll have another couple of months, you'll stick around. And a one-on-one, like a couple of weeks later, he was like, so I'm leaving. And I was like, wait, what? And Matt Kohler that I mentioned earlier, he left around that time. Dustin Moskovitz left around that time. So there were a lot of people who I thought were contributing to the vigorous intellectual debate, who were kind of selectively removing themselves from the rocket ship because it was going in one direction. And so yeah, I think if I had brought it up in 2007, I probably did, and then we probably had a good discussion about it, and we tried to achieve a good outcome. But ultimately, you're kind of trying to achieve a goal that requires deprioritizing these kinds of discussions and just focusing on the corporate outcome.
Right. Just make a decision and move. No more debate. Yeah. Yeah. I could see that. So you have a very famous quote, an extremely you are almost like a person who follows a quote. You have this quote that was in Fast Company, which is I believe it's the greatest minds of my generation are figuring out how to make people click more ads. That sucks, something to that extent. But the story behind this quote is not what it seems. I wonder if you can talk about that and just, that moment in your life.
Yeah, it was actually Business Week.
Sorry.
I mean, they're somewhat interchangeable to me as well, so I don't want to. So it grew out of. I got to know a guy named Ashley Vance, who was just at the time that I got to know him, he worked for a company called The Register, and The Register had this like weirdly deep technology section where like they were the only people writing articles about like nerdy things that I cared about, like databases and file systems. And so there was also a guy named Kate Metz there who just has a big new book out on AI. So like a lot of the people who are at The Register have done quite well. And Ashley obviously is quite famous for his biography of Elon Musk. And Ashley's a really interesting guy. So he was just someone that I got to know and enjoyed having conversations with. And, he basically said, hey, my editor wants an article about the bubble. I don't want to write about the bubble. Everybody's writing about the bubble. Would you mind just kind of having a conversation with me and going on record so that I can have something more interesting to say than just like, there's a bubble, which was what everyone was writing about. And so yeah, it was really just like an hour of hanging out with Ashley and kind of talking about the world. And, I read a lot. If there's any kind of like one defining feature of me as a human, it's just that I read a lot. And, I was really like any sort of angsty Midwestern teen. I was really into poetry for a while. So I often, great poetry equips you with these sentence structures that are just adjacent when generating text during discourse. And it was really just taking a sense of just how bored I was of the problems inside of large consumer web properties. There's definitely very interesting science to be done, even to this day, on click-through rate prediction and like surfacing the right person in people you may know. Sure, the underlying algorithms are interesting, but the actual problem you're solving, I just wasn't interested in. I never was, to be honest, in any of that stuff. So it was really just expressing a frustration that, the people that I worked with were absolutely some of the smartest people I'd ever met. I was a math major at Harvard, so I feel like I'd seen some pretty smart people come through there. And at the time, the kind of the reputation was if you were just sort of an incredibly smart math person, you would go become a quant on Wall Street. But that was fading. All of those people who were the top mathematics people, and obviously this is like one form of intelligence. I don't want to like the notion of what intelligence is like, but let's just say, so in the category of like mathy people, the people who dominated within that category, they generally went to go be quants on Wall Street for a certain amount of time, but that was shifting to where they were all going to work at Google and Facebook and other companies like that. And so it was really just kind of observing that the problems these people are going to work on are boring, but these are all the people that I would have considered, if you'd asked me to say, like, who were the 5 smartest people that you sat next to in college at some point, like, it's surprising how many of them found their way into this problem domain. And that just felt like, okay, we design incentive structures as a society, and it feels like we've suboptimally designed our incentive structures if like this is the problem that these people are being attracted to.
Do you feel like the greatest minds of your generation are still working on helping people click ads? Is there something different? Has the mood shifted another way?
Honestly, and I'm not saying this just to lean into where your thinking has gone, but most of the smartest people I know now are thinking about climate change. It's really in the last 2 years, something has happened. And when I catch up with people who I think of as just like people that I think are really smart, that I just like hearing what they're thinking about, I'm amazed at how many of them are just all in on thinking about climate change. So I would say, for a while I was biased because I was working in biomedicine. So I definitely felt like I could feel some pull into to healthcare and life sciences. But that's for people who have a sense of, I don't want to just make a lot of money and challenge myself, which by the way, I'm completely fine with. That's like a reasonable rubric to use to determine what to do with your life. For the people who are trying to like search for deeper meaning and think about like, how can I work on something that makes me feel like I'm engaged in a meaningful endeavor? It's almost always climate change now. It's interesting.
So tell me about what you're doing now and especially the structure of what you're doing now.
Yeah. So Related Sciences is a biotech venture creation firm. In the technology world, you might say startup studio. So essentially, we're a company that has access to capital, but instead of just giving that capital to people who've started companies, we're starting the companies ourselves and then putting capital into them at the earliest phases. Eventually, they raise outside capital, but we provide the initial capital. And so Related Sciences grew out of a number of different constraints. One was simply an observation that the leading early stage investors in biotech had all moved to this venture creation model. Some of them started that way, some of them found their way there, some of them are only halfway there, but almost all of them are doing a lot of, if not all of their companies have been created. So it's as if in the technology ecosystem, in the software world, it's as if like Excel, Sequoia, Benchmark, whoever you consider to be the most prestigious top early stage technology investors, it's as if they all decided to stop investing in outside companies and starting their own companies. So that's going to, that would cause you to reflect, I think, as someone who participated in that industry. And so I was reflecting on that fact. And then, someone I had gotten to know through my work at Mount Sinai, who had worked at two of those firms that I thought of as like two of the three leading firms, had moved to Denver to start a family, similar to how I had moved to Charleston to start a family. And so we got to talking about, wanting to participate in having an impact on what medicines are available for disease, while doing so, not living in San Francisco or Boston. And, there was a third person who I had gotten to know through one of my funders for my lab, the Parker Institute for Cancer Immunotherapy. And so he had been very thoughtful about creating a lot of financing for early stage biotech ventures. And so the three of us started getting together. Actually, our first get together was almost exactly 3 years ago today at Joshua Tree. And we would just get together for a long weekend and just kind of brainstorm about, well, what kind of vehicle would, conform to our, the constraints we place upon ourselves in our personal life, as well as, with our moral perspectives. And so we eventually came up with this biotech venture creation firm, which is going to create new ventures at a relatively, I don't want to say leisurely, but not breakneck pace. So the goal we set for ourselves is every 18 months, we'll create a company. And when we create a company, rather than hiring 1,000 people, we're going to leverage what are called contract research organizations, or CROs. So we're going to leverage CROs. So each company we create is effectively a virtual company where we have a small number of people who manage it, but the actual experiments are run by the people that we pay at other companies that don't participate in the headcount of the company. So this allows Related Sciences itself to be, and I should mention, we're specifically focused on preclinical therapeutics development. So we're trying to take something from an idea to a molecule that's ready to be put into humans. So we're focused on that phase. We want to do that through virtual biotech venture creation. We want to do it every 18 months. And this is solving for constraints that we had. So I did never want to participate in a hypergrowth startup again. It's a very alienating experience, and it's not something that I felt like I liked myself when I was doing the things necessary to succeed. You very explicitly can't build strong interpersonal relationships with the people that you work with, because as the founder and major shareholder, you have to make decisions that might not be in the best interest of that person as an individual. You have to kind of make decisions that are in the best interest of the company. You're hiring so aggressively that you're building these, like when I hire someone, I genuinely get to know them, and I try and build a relationship with them. And I only try and make an offer if I genuinely believe that the job I have is the best job for this person. And if you're doing that at a scale, at a pace that leads to like thousands of employees over the course of a year or two, then at some point you're unable to maintain those relationships, and you feel like you're letting those people down. You're being inauthentic, because I genuinely did care about them as I was meeting them, but then like I had to move on to the next one, and I didn't have enough time to sort of like devote to these people that I genuinely did care about, but there was just too much. And at some point you have to, so with related sciences, hopefully there's no need to grow beyond, a dozen, 2 dozen people in the company. And, one of my other co-founders, his concern was more around pace, where, our belief is like, science moves at the speed of science, at the speed of reality. Like you can only discover new things carefully and thoughtfully. And so we wanted to create a pace that was fast enough to generate an economic return, but slow enough that we could allow for, science to happen, and as well as life to happen. So, one of my co-founders had a kid recently and was able to step away for 2-3 months. One of my direct reports has been away for 2 months as well, starting a family. So we wanted to have a pace that was, we wanted to have a business model that could allow for life to happen, for us to, and so by being virtual, we're not carrying these huge fixed costs where like we just have to, we have this like runway that's going to run out in 18 months. We just have to hit our milestones. We have the ability to basically hibernate if we don't have a good idea in front of us, or the science isn't moving at the speed that we want. It's not a big deal. We take a few months, and so that's some of the constraints we put upon ourselves, and we're very early, so we'll see if it ends up being successful.
I like this thought of like being able to hibernate as like a metric for a health or success of a business. I think that's a good. So the Mount Sinai research was doing like data-driven immunotherapy. Is this similarly like you're throwing massive amounts of data at a problem, seeing what pops out the other side? And if I'm to think of like, I only vaguely know what the entire supply chain of like a drug is, and in terms of like starting with some academic doing some research that eventually gets commercialized, applied. So where in that chain are you?
Yeah, we're very early. We're upstream from a lot of things in the chain. So there are two primary ways that a new idea for a drug emerges. The first is called a phenotypic screen. And this is where you take some model system that's representative of a disease that you'd like to cure, whether it's like a cellular model or an animal model, or even some humans and data you've generated from intervening in humans. So you take some model, and then you take a large number of potential interventions. Those might be drugs. They might be antibodies. I like to use the term intervention to be broad. So you take some library of interventions and you throw it at the model, and you see and then you measure what happens to the model when you hit it with those interventions. And you see if any of those interventions look promising in terms of taking the model from the disease state into a healthy state. And that's phenotype-driven drug discovery. And it's how most drugs were discovered in the beginning of the biopharma market. The other approach, which has become possible with new technologies, is target-driven drug discovery, where you try to figure out, is there a biological entity, which most often is a protein? Is there a biological entity that I can perturb in some way to create the disease state from a healthy state or to reverse the disease state into a healthy state. And that becomes the focus of the drug development effort. So you say like, oh, okay, this protein is critical to this disease process. So if I could make a drug that did something to that protein, then I would be successful. So related sciences takes more of a target driven approach than a phenotype driven approach. Both are equally valid. I have some reasons for preferring the target driven approach. I think it can be a bit more efficient in terms of use of capital, which is one of the primary challenges of drug discovery right now, is just it's getting more and more expensive to make new drugs. And we really need as an industry to think about how to make that more efficient. So what the data sets that we're working with are primarily open data sets. There are some data sets that we pay for. In particular, there are firms like Clarivate or Informa who have people observing the biopharmaceutical industry and recording data about it. So every time a clinical trial gets run or a merger acquisition gets executed, they stick that into a database. And so they've done a good job of curating that data. So we pay them to access that data. But ultimately, there's a tremendous amount of data that gets made available in an open setting. And in particular, we have our perspective of related sciences is that the best evidence that a particular target is related to a particular disease is going to be discovered in humans. And so we look for human evidence, and in particular, we like human genetic evidence. So, when we're born, we possess an array of mutations in our DNA that was effectively assigned to us randomly. So through the process of recombination, you've been given a set of mutations, some from your mother, some from your father, that, hopefully the selection of those mutations was not biased. There's presumably a lot of randomness in that. So we can simulate the conditions of a randomized controlled trial within humans, where the intervention in this case is the set of mutations in your germline DNA. And then we can observe the impact of those mutations on health outcomes and other aspects of your life. And so there's a really fundamental project that has been going on for 2 decades now called the UK Biobank. And the UK Biobank was remarkably prescient in that, well over a decade ago, they said, let's take 500,000 people who live in the UK, and we want them to be above a certain age, because above a certain age, health events happen at a greater rate. So that's going to make the data set more interesting. And let's gather as much data as we can about them. So first of all, since we have a single payer, single provider, we can get all their medical records very easily. And then we can also perform additional measurements if we bring them into facilities over time. And then let's structure that data and then make it available to researchers under a data use agreement that ensures they're not going to do anything reprehensible with the data. And most critically, the UK Biobank several years ago said, let's do genome sequencing on all 500,000 of these people. So there's this remarkable data set accessible to researchers, which has 500,000 people who have been what we would call deeply phenotyped. So phenotype is effectively some aspect of your being, like what diseases you have or how tall you are, or your eye color. Or it could even be a molecular phenotype, like your red blood, your white blood cell count, or something like that. So the UK Biobank has a tremendous amount of deep phenotype data together with genotype data. And this data set is the ideal data set, we think, for discovering evidence that a particular target is important to treat a particular disease. And it turns out that the UK Biobank isn't the only biobank of this scale that's being built. And there was a recent paper from Calico, which is a spin out of Alphabet, focused on life sciences, where they estimated that within the next 3 years, there's going to be over 35 million people who have their data deposited into a biobank like the UK Biobank, accessible to researchers. So that really is the primary source of data, coupled to information about how pharma companies behave, contained in data sets like Inform and Clarivate, that we are using to identify compelling targets and the relevant diseases for those targets to initiate preclinical drug discovery against.
That's amazing. That's amazing that there's a resource like that. I feel like we need some digital equivalent as a way to break some data monopolies. The idea that everyone can work off of such a great data source is amazing. So I was watching. I watched you on Charlie Rose in 2013, and so young. You look so young, and there's something you said that really struck me. You said we're just now entering a period where, for the first time in human history, the vast majority of our actions will be digitized. So let's at least give ourselves the tools and the option to perform numerical thinking alongside our very well developed mechanism for narrative thinking. And a year later, you did a talk at Berkeley, where it's sort of similar train of thought. You said it makes me uneasy when I think about how much corporations are measuring about human interactions today, not making considered decisions about what gets measured, but deciding what gets measured is really a political and ethical choice. Um, do you want to reflect on either of those quotes now? Do those things still feel true, less true, more true?
Yeah, absolutely. The first quote, I'm impressed at my own how articulate I was then. It's sad how old and slow I am now. No, I like that. I like the framing that past Jeff used there, because yeah, there are things you see when you use models to interpret um, digital representations of reality that you don't see when you're equipped with the senses with which we are all equipped, and you apply the things that the reasoning that your brain comes out with. And I think a lot of those things that you might see could have tremendous value, but obviously they could also be used for nefarious purposes. So I guess the second quote is definitely, that's where my thinking has gone mostly. So in the last several years, and in particular, actually, a good friend of mine who lives out in LA, he was having a kid a few years ago, and we were, sitting on the rooftop of the Rose Hotel after dinner that I think you were at, and we were kind of talking about what it's like to be a father. I had just had a kid. He was starting to have a kid, and he said, I'm getting a lot of anxiety about moral reasoning and equipping my son with like a moral philosophy to engage the world with. I think about it like literally every day, that the thing, it's something my mom used to always say to me, like, I know a lot of people in the environments that I've participated in the last 2 decades that grew up in households where a lot of pressure was put upon them to achieve successful outcomes for some conventional notion of success. And my parents were almost the opposite, where they were like, the more successful I was, the less impressed they were. And they would always say, we just want you to be a good person. It was the only thing that, and the genius of that has only compounded for me as a father. And so I think of those two things, my friend telling me like the urgency of learning moral philosophies to equip his son with something to face the world. And then my mom just saying over and over to me, like, I just want you to be a good person. And it's so what does it mean to be a good person? And how can I teach someone to be a good person? Or at least how can I give them the tools? And actually, doing my undergraduate degree at Harvard, we had a core curriculum. And one of the requirements of the core curriculum was to do a moral reasoning course. So it's the things that I read in that course I've reflected upon more since attending Harvard than almost anything else I learned in my undergraduate. So a lot of my reading recently has been on tools from moral and political philosophy that we might use as a society to arrive at the right framework for thinking about the morality of surveillance. So, it's very clear we need to reassess. I think the problem statement is inarguable. But then where people moving past that problem statement and starting to get towards, what are the constructivist notions that we can use, so things like social contract theory and the various like contemporary manifestations of that from like John Rawls famously, but I find like David Gauthier's Morals by Agreement, Scanlon's What We Owe Each Other. And actually, I think Spheres of Justice is cited by you in your book, which is another really interesting. I think actually the evolution of social contract theory in the last 20 years has been around recognizing the multiplicity of spheres in which we need to run these contracting or bargaining simulations. And so I think we as a society need to engage in, the first order social contract bargaining required to understand, like, okay, now that we know the tendencies of corporations and surveillance in the contemporary setting, where do we want to get to? What does distributive justice, what does intergenerational justice look like in a world that looks like the one that we have, and not the one in which these theories were formulated? And I don't know what answer is going to come out of that process. So for me, it's more about what's the right process for us all to engage in, and where's that conversation happening? And I should probably be in there because like I have some thoughts on this. And so that's recently, and honestly, your like dark forest theory of the internet was, I'm still marinating on it. I'm still trying to stay in the dark forest because I'm pretty terrified of it. I admire I've kind of been observing you, thinking like, okay, maybe I could do that someday and start kind of like poking my head out again and talking to people. But to be frank, like, where things have gone with, I don't use any social media today because it's such a noxious context for thinking and for discourse that I don't really understand why people do, besides putting a press release out. Uh, so
Yeah, I mean, I was looking. I didn't see any interview or public statement from you in many years. I mean, maybe I'm not up on your Bebo or whatever. Maybe you just switched. I want to go back to something you said. I didn't quite understand, but like people who are seeing, when you are seeing people through data, you are seeing something different than someone who's not seeing through data. What are those things that you see different? What were you thinking about when you said that?
So one example that jumps to mind is there's some very cool work out of MIT, and unfortunately, the researcher's name is not at the top of my head, but they work on something called affective computing, where they can use computer vision to detect emotional states that might not be apparent to people that have a hard time detecting emotional states using, the sensory and reasoning apparatus that they've been equipped with from birth. So often these are, autistic people or other people who have, deficits of perceiving emotion. And so there, that's one thing that you can imagine that an algorithm can see that could, bring someone up to the same sort of perception level that the rest of us have. Um, but in general, there are patterns that we don't. Another like simple example could be, I could take a recording of this talk, and I'm sure I would recognize verbal tics or things that I'm doing that I wish I weren't, in terms of how I speak, that could be arrived at just by watching it. But I could also run algorithms over it that could detect things that I didn't personally detect just by watching it. That might say, "Oh, hey, you're using words of Germanic origin in situations where, had you used one from like a Romance language, you would have been perceived more softly." So there are things like that where I think that allowing algorithms to operate upon a digital representation of reality can give us a deepened awareness of what reality is. That is genuinely exciting for me, and one of the reasons why I enjoy working in data. But then obviously there are things that you can do with those insights, that, things like predictive policing, which I don't like and should not be done. So that does that give you a better, more concrete
Yeah,
sense of
yeah,
what I was thinking
totally.
about?
So, I mean, there is some like inevitability of our actions became digitized and more intricately measured at this moment, just because the tools were available for that to happen. But why, if you think about the organizations you've been a part of, or even just the field, why do we choose to measure something? Like, who is it that decides whether something is going to get measured? Is that that decision of what gets measured and what doesn't get measured is kind of an invisible choice. Is that something that you think about or have reflections on?
Yeah, so I think there's two pieces. There's what we choose to measure, but there's also what we can measure. And so I think those two things determine structures of society to a much greater extent than we recognize. And there's a book that I read. So our mutual friend Ian Hogarth. I remember after I read this book, I was just like, it was an amazing book. It's slipping my head right now. Maybe I'll I'll look it up later. But it was effectively going through one of their examples that I specifically recall was the British Navy. And as we gain the ability to measure and communicate, so I guess that's the other piece is what can we measure and what can we then communicate. But obviously, communication infrastructure at this point is so ubiquitous that it's not as critical. But it basically showed how the hierarchical structure of the British Navy was reorganized entirely based upon our ability to measure and communicate the state of like the various naval battles or the training that was occurring. And so I think that, and this led me down the road. You know, there's another book, Seeing Like a State, that's very popular amongst people. Led me down the road of thinking about, yeah, like what are the appropriate government and corporate organizational designs that fall out of these novel measurement capabilities. And then to your question about what do we choose to measure, I mean, that is absolutely, I mean, it's just so like the way that I said it in that talk, I think is the way that I still think about it today is that it is it's a moral, it's an ethical choice. And it's something that we need to grapple with in the same way that we think about, you know, I think we need thought experiments related to measurement in the same way that we have thought experiments related to like the trolley problem. Now, I think moral philosophers should be equipped with. So I think a lot about how much we measure individual contributors relative to executives, and a lot of like the dysfunction of contemporary society related to the lack of consequences for people who penetrate a certain level of you know, capital versus labor. So you know, I think about what it would like, what would happen if you did like performance management for executives, where you like you micro measured them and you hired and fired based on their you know, we want like what if we treated them as coin operated in the same way that they treat their individual contributors as coin operator, and would they flourish in those environments? So I actually find myself arguing against measurement in many situations in which, you know, customers of mine at Cloudera or, you know, companies that I invest in now, they're pursuing a strategy that involves measurement and where I can see the potential for improved business outcomes, but I also see the potential for you know, reduced societal outcomes. And you know, to put it in the language of the bento, like, you know, would future us want that measurement act to be performed? And I'm very uncomfortable. I think right now we're erring on the side of, if it makes us money, we're going, you know, in your language, the financial maximization is really the ethical principle that's being applied to whether or not we should measure something, and we need to move to a different ethical principle.
Yeah, I mean, you got right to what I think is so important of like people in power decide what gets measured. They measure things that are ultimately in their interest. And so you have things like workplace monitoring for lower level employees, but not for higher level employees, even though higher level employees actually might be more prone to commit greater crimes and have a greater impact on the business. And so what that reveals is the way that measurement is a form of control. You know, it reveals like all of these ways that it's, you know, you could argue it's about outcome, but really it's about who is deciding what gets measured and who decides the consequences of those measurements. And so that's where a lot of stuff is happening now. I mean, it feels like Facebook data is a little bit similar, where, you know, we as the consumers have, you know, we are more helpless, we are less empowered, we are disempowered by this data that someone else has about us.
Yeah, that. So when we think about freedom, you know, like freedom from domination is a term that I see a lot in moral philosophy, and yeah, like freedom from observation. You know, I actually, there was a conversation I had a long time ago where someone said something that it changed the way I thought of cities forever. Where they said the city invented anonymity, and I think about growing up in the Midwest in a smaller town, And even though I wasn't fully surveilled, I did feel coupled to um, an identity that had been constructed by others and given to me. And moving to New York City, you know, that identity was no longer coupled to me. But then we reinvented small town life, and this is nothing new. I mean, Marshall McLuhan like has given lectures on this for 50, 70 years. Uh, but yeah, but it really struck me that we've basically uninvented anonymity, and perhaps there's a role for it in contemporary society. I don't think we're going to figure it out on the timeline of our lives, though. I think we're going to live in an era where anonymity is not a choice that we can make, and we need to figure out, okay, is that something that matters, and how do we construct a society in which that is a choice? How can we recapture the global we've become this, like, the global village, and how can we recapture a metropolis? How can we reconstruct a metropolis in the digital realm is a really fascinating challenge.
It's such a it's so telling of our age that as you say that, you raise these great moral questions, and thinking about future anonymity, my like solutionist mind is like, is this a blockchain problem? Is this what blockchain is going to solve? Is there an NFT for this? But that's how we think now, I think. um, so there's two questions that are related and are really big, and I just keep thinking about, and I'd love to know what you think. But can we how can we quantify the certainty of knowledge, slash, like, how certain can we or should we be in the things that we learn from data? Like, there is this kind of like information veracity certainty question on a lot of levels, and I'm curious how you think about it.
Yeah, well, now you're driving straight into the applied epistemology framing. Like, ultimately, statistics is statistics as practice in academia is a subset of mathematics, but statistics as practice in industry is a subset of epistemology. So, like, that was kind of the split that caused the creation of the term data science in my brain. So what can be known and what tools can we use to know is at the foundation of everything that I think about. So I it is it's such a big question. It's hard to know where to even begin. I spend a lot of my time as a data scientist uh, talking to executives about basically saying, no, we can't know that. Uh, so, so I would say that I think the general perception, uh, possibly because of the marketing arms of companies like the one I created and others similar to it, has a perception that we can do more, we can be more certain about the world with data than we actually can. And I really like. There's a book by Duncan Watts called "Everything Is Obvious," and I love this book because the thesis, or the motivating notion of the book is that you can take a study that's been done in a social science, and you can tell people about the study, and then tell them that the result was one way, and then take another group, tell them the result was the exact opposite way, and both groups will say, well, that was exactly what I expected to occur. uh, so so there's, like, what can be known is often influenced by how we convince ourselves that we know something. So another way to say this is, I used to tell people in my group that it's not important that we are helpful. It's important that we are perceived to be helpful. Uh, because most people, when they encounter the data science group, they expect to be helped in a certain way. And ultimately, the way that we would help them was actually in just sort of like disabusing of the notion that they could be helped, but giving them the sensation that they had been helped. So I have pretty conservative expectations about what we can know. And in fact, like, even in my personal life, in situations where people close to me have had medical issues where they've reached the limits of what is known, and they say, well, let's not give up. let's keep pushing. Like, we have to do everything we can to make sure this doesn't happen. And then I have to say, like, okay, we're kind of at the boundary of what can be known. These are the tools that we have that I'm aware of to create knowledge about biology, and these are the experimental designs that we could construct to create some knowledge. And ultimately, I don't think we can actually know the question that an answer to the question you're asking. So I think I have a tremendous amount of I'm very conservative in what I believe can be known about the world. So yeah, I guess I remain maybe. I would also say that people who are thinking hardest about this are in the social sciences, and they aren't given the resources they need or the respect they need. There's a continued sense we're still sort of shedding from the 20th century, honestly, from the first half of the 20th century, that physics is real science, and chemistry is like sort of real science, and biology is kind of fake, and social science is not a science. Whereas understanding like how people like on some level, what else is there but social science for humans? So when we want to start talking about moral philosophy and things, so I think there's a tremendous amount of good work being done in the realm of quantitative social science, and I think more resources should go into it. And the tools they're developing around things like causal inference and observational settings are growing what can be known faster than other fields of inquiry.
So it's like like a bringing that numerical lens to human interactions, not to proxies of interactions. There's a more understandableness maybe that also makes it feel a little bit more like BS potentially, but it's trying to bring math and statistics into that, right? So is that fair?
Yeah, I would say like math and statistics are tools that are part of some evidence creation process. So I'd say more about like bringing the scientific method into it, and not allowing for, they're like, so we all passed through 4 traumatic years, and sure, there was, for many, the history of the United States has been traumatic. So saying just 4 traumatic years, I don't want to undersell what many have experienced throughout the history of the United States, but certainly these 4 traumatic years were traumatic in their own way. And so I think, like many of us, I was reading social scientists who passed through the previous emergence of fascist regimes internationally. So people like Adorno and what's the Frankfurt School, the other folks from there.
Yeah, Benjamin
Benjamin and
Gramsci. Yeah,
exactly. So just reading a lot of those books, and Eric Fromm, and ultimately Escape from Freedom. That one is one that like I felt like that title was resonating through my brain for all 4 years, and I find what they were doing interesting, but ultimately it's not science. So I think like so what I mean is like social scientists, it's not just mathematics and statistics. It's actually like one of the experiences of reading the economics literature for me. So I was like a course assistant for a mathematics course on convex optimization, through which many PhDs in economics passed while I was still an undergrad. And when I would read kind of the economics literature, to the eyes of someone who approached it as a mathematician, it felt like it was almost like they were like stunting. They were like, they were bringing in unnecessary mathematical machinery to basically just sort of like show off how it was their way. It was difficult for me to consume that literature, because to me the mathematics was quite straightforward, and then ultimately the content of the paper was very limited, because most of what they wanted to say was like obfuscated in this like math. So I actually would almost uncomfortable when people bring too much mathematics and statistics into it, but I do want them to bring in just like the basics of experimental design and reproducibility, and just ensuring, and some more like epistemological considerations than just like the technology of mathematics and statistics.
Yeah. So I have 3 last questions. One is something you made a reference to earlier, But how do the ethics of corporations influence the ethics of individuals? That's all. That's
In a
all.
way that is not good, I would argue, particularly like large multinational corporations. Moral Mazes is a touchstone book for me and a lot of people, I think, where it's this like almost like difficult to read like ethnography of middle management in corporate America in the mid 20th century, and it really spoiled for me the desire to ever create a large corporation again. So, uh, and I saw it in practice. It was nice because there were a number of books that I read around that time. Unfortunately, that none of them are right at hand for me. But that's the one that really kind of stood out as sort of the one I remember. And I just saw it happening to people around me. I think about like who were the people that I befriended, in high school and in college and early after college. And like, what did I find interesting about them and what drew me to them? What were kind of like their aspects of charisma? And then what were our shared values about the world and how do we arrive at those values? And then, the period of like 2008 to 2012 is like when I had started Cloudera and I was interacting with a lot of people who I had known for a long time, but we were now in this new setting of corporate America, effectively, and everybody got so boring and so similar. And I just it was so frustrating. And then there was all this stuff around like bring your authentic self to work, and I just kept thinking about who is it, like Baudrillard, who wrote about like wrestling and politics and the similarities. And I was like, corporate America is just wrestling. Like we're all like we're all like mimicking these, like I'm giving my interview about like how much I'm gonna beat that guy up, but like actually I have my own like conceptual state. So like we're all piloting these identities. We've all crafted these like wrestling characters, and we're in the ring sort of like wrestling with each other. And like the whole time I'm like sitting objectively and just thinking like, wow, like this is just so much bullshit. Like what is happening? And I just watched so many people that I thought were interesting and had novel perspectives in the world adopt the perspective of their employer for whatever reason, whether they're like resolving cognitive dissonance, whether they actually had latent in them that viewpoint, and then just being placed in an environment where they were handed arguments for that viewpoint, it emerged, and that's actually like what they truly believed. But yeah, and this is difficult because I interact with people who exist in corporate America quite regularly, and I like it's kind of like saying that people who think about clicking on ads, that sucks, and now all of a sudden like anyone who works in advertising feels like I don't respect them as a human. And so I want to be nervous. I want to be careful about how I say this. Like there are many reasons why participating in corporate America makes sense for many people, and I don't want to feel like I'm. But for me personally, the changes that I observed in people that I loved and cared about, it really made me reflect on how those changes came about and how much the environment of corporate America caused those changes. And like one of my favorite SNL skits of the recent era, I don't know if you saw this one. I think it was when Kristen Stewart hosted, and they did like a Sum 41 style like pop rock song, where they're in the office and they're all interns and like they hate their boss, and they're doing this like I'll never grow up sort of like pop rock song, and then like the boss like says something nice about like the work they did, and then the song like slowly evolves into like how cool their boss is and how good of a job they want to do on their presentation. and, like, and like that perfectly encapsulated my experience. And I'm fortunate that like for me, the goals that I have in life uh, didn't require me to persist in that environment much longer. And so like I could maintain this viewpoint. So I know how like it's a very privileged viewpoint to say like most of us have to engage with corporate, but I do wish that like it really led me to believe that like so I don't know if you watched the Sarah Lacey interview I did a long time ago, but okay, so that was you did a pretty comprehensive search of the archive, saw that maybe.
I did see the Sarah Lacey one. I did not watch it. I did not watch that.
So she asked me like, what's one thing that you think you believe that's different from most of the people in Silicon Valley? And I just said, I think much less highly of capitalism than than most people in Silicon Valley, and that's a big part of it. Is I think like we've we've constructed, and actually I noticed one of your favorite philosophers, Anderson, her most recent book,
Elizabeth Anderson. Yeah.
Elizabeth Anderson, her most recent book is, I'm really looking forward to reading it. It's basically about like, why have we chosen to allow corporations to have such broad decisions over our personal lives? And so I suspect she's articulated this better than I ever could. But yeah, ultimately, like, I wish that people could retain more individuality in outlook and still participate in economic, the modern economy, and still, achieve gains from that while retaining some sense of individuality. And a lot of it has to do with how much we couple to being employed in the US, right. Like health insurance and the precarity that we've placed so many people into, that people feel like, hey, I have to play this game or else I don't, like, there's a lot of really negative consequences that occur.
Yeah, there's a lot at stake.
Yeah.
It makes me think of two things. I mean, I like how, you make someone joining corporate America almost sound like someone becoming religious. Like, can I make the same jokes around them anymore? This is now a more devout person than I am. I need to check myself. Like, I get a little bit of that spirit. And it also, for me, like being a CEO, being an executive, thinking about company culture, because really we're kind of talking about culture as in, like, how do we define our tribe? What do we want? What's important to us? How, we want people to see things in a similar way, which, for what you said earlier about you want your exponential line, you want everyone to sort of be going in the same direction. But here, I think you're highlighting the real cost of that, which is like, maybe you're a great team player 9 to 6 and your teammates are like, Jenny has all the flair, but outside of work, the rest of her friends are like, what happened to Jenny? And Jenny became a zombie, and that's a little bit of what happens to people.
Yeah. I actually remember there was somebody that I really liked that I worked with at Facebook from the early days. And I had a conversation with him like 10 years after leaving Facebook. And he used a phrase that I had never heard anyone use while I was at Facebook, where he said something like, oh yeah, that person, they never bled blue. And I was like, what? Were people saying that? Like, is that a thing? and I just, like, that, it almost perfectly captured what, I never felt of that. And almost like that is my notion of corporate culture, is that if you in any way identify with the group of people that are your employer in a way that's greater than you identify with whatever's happening outside of this sphere, then we failed as a corporate culture. So I almost like, I want to have as little, like, minimum viable corporate culture, I guess, like, to use like an Eric Ries term, because but to maintain the synchrony of motion required for thousands or tens of thousands of people to accomplish tasks in unison, you're a cult. Like, there's no, it would be very, very difficult to distinguish, like the someone's feelings about a cult leader from someone's feelings about their CEO. And I could never participate in that.
Or maybe to do that again, it might take like climate level emission, or maybe you participated in your own way. But I think this is where, to some degree, we do need people to give up some of their individualism to be a part of larger changes. There's probably parts we all have to give up, and then parts we have to, like, our systems need to respect and honor about us, and like, don't touch. And maybe when you're saying like, maybe while we're around, that problem isn't solved, but maybe for further generations it is. There's a question you asked in one of the talks that I loved, and it's a question I've been thinking a lot about, which is, how do corporations die? And you're talking about all these zombie companies in the world, and I've been thinking about this exact same question. And what it has made me think about, and I wonder what you think about this, is it's made me wonder whether companies should have wills. Like, could a company declare from the very beginning, we are dead if this happens. If this happens, here's the do not resuscitate order. If we ever find ourselves, if employees ever say we're bleeding blue, please shut us down at that moment. But some notion of like, going astray, truly going astray, and whether that could be hard coded. And but I'd love to hear you talk about companies dying and companies maybe having wills or something like that.
Well, the first thing I thought of when you said that is my mom always says to me, "If I get a perm, shoot me." Uh, so that's like I'm gonna continue like now. Whenever I bring up companies dying, I'm gonna use this as the that like your pre yeah, that's her. It's like the do not resuscitate. It's like if there's a perm on this head, so yeah. So in any case, no, this is something, and I guess in my story I did not include, but the last year, around this time last year, I was basically working full time to help create something called the COVID Tracking Project, which became an authoritative source of state level data on tests, cases, hospitalizations, and deaths from COVID-19 in the United States. And that organization just shut down. So I think this is a fantastic example of a mission driven organization that may have had some aspects of a cult like character that I was happy to participate in. So I'm glad that this came up. So yeah, and I was just like, one of the things that they're doing right now at the COVID Tracking Project, now that it shut down, is they're doing like an oral history project where a reporter is interviewing all of the people who were involved, and just to sort of have a time capsule of what happened. And I brought this up, actually. I brought up that my esteem for the leaders of the COVID Tracking Project grew immensely when they made the difficult decision to not capitalize on the achievement of the COVID Tracking Project. I mean, this thing had like 500,000 plus Twitter followers. These people are like journalists. They work in an industry that's had, a very difficult time rewarding its highest achievers. And, this absolutely could have been a vehicle for self-aggrandizement for the leaders. And they made an incredibly humble choice to shut it down because it made sense. If you paid attention to the motivating mission of the organization, then this was clearly the right call. And I wish corporate America, and in fact, like corporate America has asserted that corporations should be considered as people, should be treated as people, like literally by the law. And I'm no expert on that, but there are other people that can provide a lot more color on that. But you know what? People die. And most of what makes us human is just working backwards from that. And why can't corporations be under the same restrictions? I think capital, I'm not, so I don't love capitalism, but I don't think there's an alternative ideology I think the arena in which the market economy makes sense is much smaller than the vast majority of Americans think. But I still think it makes sense for a subset of economic transactions. But even for that subset of economic transactions, there are modifications. Like capitalism isn't like one thing. It's a huge. There's like the implementation of the distance between the like Platonic ideal of capitalism as it exists in the idea space and capitalism as it exists in meat space. There's many different configurations, and I think a configuration of capitalism that impose the organic requirement that any entity must die would be a huge. Obviously, how you implement that is left to the reader, and it's highly complex. But to me, like what I want to see is I want to see corporations as humane actors. I feel the same way about government, by the way. Like I think like we need to flip how government is constructed in the U.S. And the last 4 years, I spent a lot of time daydreaming about moving to Switzerland. And one of the fascinating things about Switzerland is like when you look at tax revenue and how it's allocated at like the city, the canton, and the country level, it's flipped from the U.S. where like the majority of taxes, and actually when you go to like get your Swiss citizenship, the entity that grants you citizenship is the city or canton rather than the country. And so these, just like corporations, so corporations should die, I believe, but corporations also should not be able to be like stunningly obese. They should not be able to be so large. Like that takes them outside of the scope of organic existence as well. And that's something that was. So I went to an acquaintance of mine from college wrote Jesse Andrews, and he writes like young adult fiction. He's incredibly clever, and one of his books was basically the premise was like you are as large as you are wealthy, and just as a way to like make manifest and give people a visceral sense of how absurd the wealth. So actually, one of the philosophers that I wanted to throw your way that I didn't know if it was in your reading stack was Ingrid Robbins. I don't know if you've read Ingrid Robbins. So she's proposing this limitarianism as a philosophy, and she so I thought of her work when you were having the donut economics discussion. So she's basically proposing like donut wealthonomics, where we have a poverty line, which is kind of the inner part of the donut, but then we also have a riches line, she calls it, where like you just, and people would say like, oh, progressive taxation is roughly that, or like look at France, like all the wealthy people moved away. Sure, so I'm sure there's implementation challenges, but I feel like I affiliate with libertarianism in many ways. So I think corporations should die. I think corporations should have there should be consequences for becoming obese. Uh, in the same way that like it's difficult to be healthy as an organic being if you consume. We need to figure out ways of a more humane capitalism and frankly a more humane political economy. Like we need governmental entities. Like for me, we should be flipping. Like I think local governments should have the vast majority of say, and then it should basically get thinner and thinner in terms of responsibilities as you go up the stack. And I'd like to see the same thing both government and corporations.
Excellent, great. So that was exactly what I was hoping for. Yeah, corporations as organic material. I think it's I like it. So my very last question, for someone who's interested in following I don't know what similar path to you says to you, but someone who is interested in data science, someone that's interested in applied research, how, if you were to be starting at this point in time, how would you think about it? Facebook's already a place that maybe, is what it is, but how would you think about entering or making a mark or doing work to be proud of?
Yeah. So I could never, I'm very grateful to, first of all, I worked on Wall Street for a year out of college and I learned a lot. They do really hard math on Wall Street. And, I learned how to code professionally. I learned how to write software as an 8-year-old and always did it as like a hobby. But, I learned how to write software professionally and how to do some really hard math on Wall Street and honestly just how to show up at work and create value for a group of people trying to solve business problems. And then at Facebook, it was tremendous. I learned how to hire and manage a team and all that goes along, and then build out the infrastructure for storing and analyzing petabytes of data. So all those skills were incredibly important to be able to do anything that I could be proud of. So I guess I'm proud of the learnings that happened, and I'm proud of the interpersonal commitments that I upheld in those work environments, but I can't say that I'm proud of the impact on the world that the work that I did at either of those places had. So I guess I would say we all have to optimize for skill building early on and preserving optionality. So I would say, I often tell people that finding a place where you can see what the win state looks like. So this place, like they're doing things right and just go like sit inside of that and pay attention. So I think like if you're coming just out of college, thinking that you can invent the win state from whole cloth is a bit naive, and every once in a while it happens, but you're probably better served by trying to observe the win state inside of somewhere that's doing good work. In terms of finding one that can align with your personal values, that's a lot harder. I personally think that the skills that we build come from the people that we solve problems with and the quality of problems we're solving. And so I would place the most emphasis on that early in my career, recognizing that until you have the economic freedom, don't put too much pressure on yourself. And this is difficult because, like, ethically, it's like, okay, even for 1 minute contributing to something that you don't fully believe in, is that something? But, like, I don't know, even like things evolve. Like Albert Wenger mentioned to you, like, when they invested in Twitter, the position was, what's the point of, that's silly. And now it's like, it's too weighty for its own good. And so, like, ethics change. I personally recognize constraints that cause people to make decisions that I might not agree with ethically, and I don't vilify them for that. I see us in kind of a continual, I personally am an incredibly flawed human. And, and so we're all, to me, we're all kind of collaboratively trying to get better, and we're all trying to solve for different constraints. So I'd say early on, find a hard problem to solve with smart people and have fun doing it. And then as you build more autonomy for yourself, that can allow you to then find your way into things that you think may be more aligned with how you feel. And I would also say, honestly, like, I don't know that I had a fully formed ethics coming out of college. And that's something that I look at with there's obviously a lot of moral controversy happening in college today. And if I try and place myself in that environment, I don't know how I would have perceived it now. Or I don't know how I would have perceived it then relative to how I perceive it now. So I don't want to put so much pressure on people to be such like fully formed ethically at the age of like 19. So I think really more focusing on building skills, keeping the option value open, is the advice that I give to people. And then figure out who you are and what you value, and then kind of like bend your career arc towards that over time.
Jeff, this was great. We should be friends or something. This was great. I love what you had to share, and yeah, I think people are going to get a lot out of this. So thanks for being so generous with your experiences. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you trying to make space for people to be able to work through these questions in an authentic way. I think a lot about them, but and I talk a lot about them with my friends, but I don't feel like there's really space in the public internet to evolve these thoughts today. So, this is kind of, like you said, I haven't really talked to anybody for about a decade. So
if only people could see what you look like right now. It's insane. It's insane.
in a public setting. So this is me trying to learn from you and experience this a bit more. So thanks for making this space.